The royal silence was deafening. Cameras flashed, aides stood frozen, and at the center of it all, King Charles sat utterly speechless. What had Princess Anne just revealed? A secret that shattered the order of succession, cracked the royal foundation, and cast a spotlight on the Queen's most protected legacy. For the first time in decades, a hidden truth had broken through the palace walls. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was supposed to be a routine, high-level meeting at Windsor Castle. A closed-door gathering of senior royals and top advisors to discuss ceremonial changes for the upcoming year. Charles had entered the room with an air of quiet command, flanked by aides, expecting nothing more than mild updates and subtle disagreements. But before the agenda was even read, Princess Anne rose from her seat. Her voice didn't tremble. Her expression didn't shift. And yet, her words cracked through the tension like glass under pressure. "There's something the Queen left behind," she said, "and it doesn't belong to you." The room froze. No one spoke. Then came the words that would upend the monarchy's center of gravity. The Queen's personal diaries. She left them to William. The silence was instant and absolute. Charles blinked as if the air had been knocked out of him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The heir, the son groomed for 7 decades. The monarch who had finally ascended had been passed over in the Queen's final act of trust. All eyes turned to Anne, who stood rooted in place, her gaze unwavering. There was no glee, no satisfaction, just unflinching purpose. One by one, palace aides and royal advisors exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. No one moved, because in that one moment it became clear this wasn't just about inheritance, this was about allegiance, a question of who the Queen truly believed would carry forward her voice, her conscience, her truth. Charles's face went pale. His hands, once calmly clasped in front of him, gripped the armrest of his chair. The weight of the throne suddenly felt heavier, not from the crown, but from the ghost of a mother who had kept her final thoughts hidden from him. Whispers broke out among those closest to the king, but Anne raised a single hand and the noise ceased. "This wasn't done lightly," she said. "She chose William not to divide us, but because he needed to know who she really was." The implication hit harder than the words themselves. Not only had the Queen excluded Charles, but she had done so with clarity and intent. This was no accident. This was legacy redefined. A stunned hush lingered in the room as the meaning of her revelations sank in. Advisors, once so sure of their place, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The royal hierarchy had not just been challenged, it had been publicly destabilized by the Queen's own blood. Anne did not explain further. She didn't need to, because the message was already echoing off the panelled walls of Windsor. The Queen's most sacred words were now in the hands of the next generation. And Charles was left with silence. But how did Anne come to possess this knowledge, and why did Queen Elizabeth bypass her own son? The answers lie buried in years of silence, secrets, and one royal woman's unshakable loyalty. Before she revealed the truth to the world, Princess Anne held on to a promise forged in the quiet of her mother's final days. Not one of ceremony or crown, but one of legacy and trust. What was hidden between the Queen and her only daughter? A pact that would shift the weight of monarchy forever. In the final stretch of Queen Elizabeth's life, as the world watched her grow increasingly frail in public appearances, something entirely different was unfolding behind closed doors. Away from the state portraits and press statements, Anne began making quiet, unannounced visits to her mother. No photographers, no aides, no schedule. These were not formal royal meetings. They were moments stripped of title, where mother and daughter spoke not as symbols, but as women weighed down by duty, memory, and unspoken truths. And in these silent hours, something unimaginable passed between them. Not just memories or farewells, but confessions. And a final request that would place Anne at the center of a storm even she didn't fully foresee. The Queen, often seen as the embodiment of reserve, opened her heart to Anne with rare vulnerability. In hushed tones, she admitted what no one else had known. For 70 years she had been keeping personal diaries. From the day she ascended the throne in 1952, she had documented her life, thoughts, regrets, suspicions, and reflections in painstaking detail. This wasn't state record. This was raw emotion, the Queen's uncensored voice. And she made it clear these words were never meant for Charles. Anne, stunned, asked the obvious question, why not her eldest son? The Queen's response was simple, yet devastating. He's waited a lifetime to wear the crown, she said, but I'm not sure he ever truly saw me. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was a quiet ache. A mother who had watched her son climb toward power without ever stopping to listen. William, on the other hand, had earned her attention in the shadows, through moments of honesty, humility, and intuition. He wasn't raised to rule, he was raised to understand. Anne listened, torn. The burden she was being cared to carry wasn't light. She had always been the royal family's steadiest force, the unshakable pillar behind the spectacle. But this was different. To be the gatekeeper of her mother's inner world, to protect her voice even after death, was to stand between two kings. She was being asked to make a choice not publicly but in her heart. Preserve the silence or tell the truth. As the Queen's health declined, Anne kept visiting. The diaries were boxed, sealed, and hidden away under the Queen's explicit instruction. But one copy, one complete set, was prepared for William to be delivered when the time was right. That time, Anne would later realize, was not marked by tradition or ceremony. It was marked by silence. The moment when the crown passed not just to a new ruler, but to a man who had no idea that the Queen's final testament would skip over his father entirely. But what exactly lay inside these diaries that made them so dangerous, so sacred, and so carefully handed to only one royal heir? Sealed in leather, bound in gold trim, and buried in a vault beneath Sandringham, Queen Elizabeth's diaries, weren't just personal thoughts. They were confessions, unfiltered, brutal, and at times damning. And William was the only one she trusted to read them. They arrived not with ceremony, but in silence. Weeks after the Queen's state funeral, as the world moved on and the royal family resumed its calculated rhythms, a plain black car pulled into Kensington Palace. No flags, no entourage. Inside the boot were two wooden cases, lacquered, locked, and marked only with a royal seal. The only person to greet the delivery was Princess Anne. She had made the journey herself, alone, carrying the full weight of her mother's final request. William stood in the corridor waiting. The exchange between them was brief, almost wordless. She opened the case, revealing row upon row of meticulously preserved volumes, each labelled by year. Some pages stiff with age, others still crisp from recent ink. He looked at her. She nodded once, and then she turned and left. There was nothing else to say. The diaries were never intended to serve history. They were never written for legacy or spectacle. They were, above all else, private. But in the hands of Queen Elizabeth, privacy became power. In her earliest entries, written in the trembling hand of a young monarch newly thrust onto the throne, there is fear. Fear of the title, fear of the family's expectations, and fear of her own silence being mistaken for weakness. She wrote of feeling trapped inside palaces, inside protocols, inside a crown that weighed more heavily than anyone imagined. There are quiet doubts about traditions she was never allowed to question, and subtle rebellions she dared only think, never speak. As William turned the pages, he watched his grandmother evolve. The tone grew firmer, the insights sharpened. By her middle years, Elizabeth had begun dissecting those around her, not cruelly but with devastati. Precision. She wrote about her children with a kind of regal detachment that at times gave way to piercing honesty. Charles, she wrote, was born into a cage of expectation, and he learned to decorate it rather than escape it. His obsession with image, his court of advisors, his need to be admired, it all alarmed her. The Queen never doubted his intelligence or sense of duty. But what gnawed at her was his tendency to confuse control with connection, presentation with truth. There were decisions he made, people he trusted, paths he chose, each noted in her hand, each wrapped in disappointment she never voiced aloud. And then, as the pages turned closer to the present, something shifted. Her words about William grew longer, more intimate. She spoke of his empathy, his quiet questions, the way he listened not to reply, but to understand. She recalled moments with him others might have forgotten, how he watched, how he learned, how he never asked for attention but always saw the things others missed. She began to write about him not as a grandson but as a bridge, between the institution and the people, between the monarchy and its reckoning. And in those same entries, her tone toward Charles grew more distant, not cruel, never unloving but undeniably resigned, as if she had already made her peace with the fact that the crown would go to one, but her truth would go to another. But William was never meant to carry this weight alone, and the emotional cost of what he uncovered would so on begin to show. The world saw William as a future king, poised, controlled, unshakable. But behind palace walls, the Queen's diaries tore at his very soul. Line by line, truth by truth, he began to see a monarchy built on silence, and the terrible price it demanded. At first, he read out of duty. He approached the diaries with reverence, believing them to be a private farewell, a final tether to the woman who had shaped his entire world. But the deeper he delved, the more he realized these weren't parting words, they were revelations. And they didn't bring peace, they brought weight, a burden of knowing, of understanding things he could never unknow. Soon, William became consumed. What began as nightly reading turned into hours behind closed doors, poring over entries that stripped away the polished image of the crown. The Queen's doubts weren't subtle, they were stark. Her disillusionment with Charles's judgment, her reservations about the future he envisioned, and the choices he made not just as a man, but as a monarch in waiting. William read her disappointment in ink and felt it burn into his skin. He stopped sleeping properly. Conversations grew shorter. Catherine noticed first his quiet stares, the weight in his eyes that no ceremony could distract from. Their children, once his sanctuary, now became silent reminders of the legacy he was supposed to carry, shaped by secrets he hadn't asked for. He didn't speak of what he read, not even to Catherine. How could he? Hope. Did he explain the feeling of watching his father's reign unfold through the judgment of a mother who had chosen not to trust him? The Queen's regrets were raw, regrets about not protecting Diana more publicly, regrets about ignoring her own instincts when Charles insisted on certain political alignments, and perhaps most painfully, regrets about allowing the monarchy to become a palace of silence instead of a house of truth. William wasn't angry. He was grieving. Grieving a version of the monarchy he'd once believed in, grieving a father whose crown came not with validation, but with a shadow cast by the one woman whose opinion mattered most. He read lines that praised his compassion, his ability to lead with heart, but those same lines condemned the system that expected him to suppress it. He began to feel torn between what the Queen wanted and what the institution demanded, and the guilt was suffocating, because for the first time in his life he held something his father never would. Not the crown, but her voice. And it wasn't celebratory. It was conflicted, anguished, and deeply human. Catherine tried to reach him, but William remained emotionally barricaded. How do you protect your family from a truth that could unravel their place in history? How do you continue to play the role of heir when your inheritance includes not just power, but pain? William was spiraling, not outwardly, not in public, but in silence. The very silence his grandmother had written against, and yet had lived within her entire reign. He had inherited her diaries, but also her isolation, and as he withdrew further into himself, one question haunted him with every page. Was he meant to break the cycle or become the next casualty of it? And yet, it wasn't William who brought the truth to light. It was Anne, in a moment of defiance, that would crack the family wide open. One summer evening at the Queen's beloved Balmoral estate, the truth could no longer be contained. Princess Anne cornered Charles not with bitterness but with duty. What unfolded was a confrontation so raw, so devastating, that its echoes still haunt the castle halls. Balmoral had always been Charles's place of refuge, a retreat from London's relentless scrutiny, from the ceremonial cages of Buckingham, from the constant reminders of who he was supposed to be. But that summer, peace didn't follow him. It arrived instead in the form of his sister, unannounced, unshaken, and carrying a truth that refused to stay buried. Anne walked through the door without invitation. No formal greeting, no scheduled audience, just a direct, unflinching presence. Charles looked up, surprised, but something in her face stopped him from speaking. She stood before him not as the Princess Royal, not even as his sister, but as the last living witness to their mother's most guarded act of trust. "You were never meant to carry her truth," Anne said. Her voice was low, steady, and absolute. The words landed like stone. Charles inked, unsure if he'd misheard. He had been clinging to the image of the Queen's legacy, believing, perhaps needing to believe, that everything she left behind would eventually point back to him. But this was betrayal. How dare she? He spat, rising from his seat. His voice cracked not with rage, but with disbelief. His entire life had been crafted around preparing for this role. He had waited longer than any heir in history. He had endured scandal, loss, exile from public favor and slow redemption. And now, standing in the heart of their mother's sanctuary, he was being told he'd been passed over in the most intimate way possible. Anne didn't waver. She didn't choose William because of the crown. She chose him because he listens. There was no malice in her tone, only clarity, and that clarity cut deeper than any insult. Because in that moment, Charles saw what he had been too proud to admit: his mother hadn't entrusted him with her voice. She had watched his rise with a quiet detachment and handed the soul of her reign to someone else. And not just anyone. To his son. The silence that followed was suffocating. Charles sank back down, his hands shaking, his eyes glassy. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Because he knew. Deep down, he had always sensed a distance in the Queen's gaze, a pause in her praise. Now he understood. The diaries weren't an inheritance, they were a judgment, a verdict passed in ink, sealed in silence, and delivered by the only person brave. Enough to speak the words aloud. Anne turned to leave. She had said what needed to be said. No press release would follow. No royal statement would acknowledge what had just taken place. But in that stone-walled room, a fracture had formed, one no crown could mend. A son had been silenced. A sister had delivered a final truth. And a mother's legacy had chosen a different path forward. But while the king wrestled with betrayal, others in the firm were already calculating the power shift and what this meant for the future crown. Two women, one crowned queen, the other poised to be. As the truth spread, Camilla burned with rage while Catherine stood at a crossroads. Should she encourage William to protect the past or let the fire of the Queen's truth consume the monarchy? When the whispers of the diaries began to circulate beyond the family's inner circle, the air inside Clarence's house grew colder. Camilla's reaction was immediate and vicious, not just at the breach of control, but at the looming threat of revelation. She knew, even before reading a word, that the Queen had written about her, and she feared those words would not be kind. Her ascent to the throne had already been marred by decades of scrutiny, skepticism, and whispers behind gloved hands. What if Elizabeth's final entries reignited everything Camilla had worked so carefully to bury? What if the Queen had left behind more than doubt? What if she had left judgment? Charles tried to calm her, but he was still really NG from Anne's confrontation. He offered no comfort, only silence and avoidance. The arguments between them turned sharp, desperate. Camilla accused him of weakness. He accused her of obsession. She demanded damage control. He could offer nothing. They both knew the truth. Whatever was written in those diaries had the power to stain the crown, fracture the family, and elevate William beyond title into myth. Meanwhile, at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine watched William unravel with each passing day. She knew he was carrying something heavier than any royal duty. She saw it in the way he held their children a little tighter, in the silence that followed his stares, in the way he avoided looking in mirrors as though afraid of seeing someone he no longer recognized. But Catherine, unlike Camilla, didn't demand answers. She waited. And when he finally confided in her, When he whispered the Queen's words about Charles, about Camilla, about him, she felt the weight of it too, and the dilemma. If he told the truth, the monarchy would never recover. But if he stayed silent, he would betray everything the Queen entrusted to him. Their conversations became strained. Catherine wanted to protect her husband, but she also feared what protecting him would cost. Could their marriage survive the storm the Diaries would unleash? Could their children inherit a throne that was quietly rotting beneath their feet? William grew increasingly torn between loyalty to the institution and fidelity to the Queen's final voice. Catherine urged caution. William felt trapped. They were no longer just navigating succession, they were navigating survival. And beneath all the public poise, Catherine faced a private truth of her own. She had been groomed to one day become queen, but that role now came wrapped in secrets, guilt, and the quiet agony of watching her husband bear the burden of a crown haunted by the past. The title she had once accepted with grace now felt laced with poison. Because while William had inherited the Queen's words, she had inherited the man those words were breaking, and neither of them could escape the silent war now raging within the royal walls. But the Queen's voice was never meant to stay buried, and the world was about to hear echoes of it louder than anyone expected. They said it was a breach, a betrayal, but to the public it was a revelation. One anonymous leak, just a single page, was enough to set fire to the monarchy's pristine image. The Queen's own words, unfiltered and unapproved, hit headlines like thunder. No one saw it coming. The page appeared first on a niche blog known for royal speculation, barely credible, often dismissed. But within hours it had been screenshotted, reposted, and confirmed by multiple sources. The Queen's handwriting, her seal, a diary entry dated less than 2 years before her passing, and the line that would ignite every corner of the British press: Charles was raised for duty, but William was born for truth. It was elegant, it was damning, and it pierced through decades of royal performance with a single sentence. Overnight, the monarchy's curtain of control was torn open, exposing a private truth that had never been meant to see daylight. News networks scrambled for experts. Analysts dissected every syllable. Was it real? What context had it been written in? Was it a personal musing or a final verdict from a monarch who had reigned for 70 years? No one could say for sure. But the damage had already begun. Charles's approval ratings, already fragile in the shadow of his mother's legacy, nosedived. The public, long accustomed to polished statements and ceremonial smiles, suddenly found themselves confronted with something far more human. A queen who had wrestled with her own doubts and chosen not to share them with the man who would replace her. William remained silent. And that silence was deafening. It gave power to the quote. It made it feel deliberate, chosen. Even Catherine, typically composed in the face of media storms, was caught off guard by the velocity of public reaction. Sympathy for William surged. He was no longer just the dutiful heir. He was now seen as the moral compass his grandmother had believed in, the man who had earned her unspoken blessing even if he had never sought it. Meanwhile, speculation exploded within palace walls. Who had leaked the page? No one knew for certain, but names floated like ghosts in every whispered conversation. Anne, fiercely loyal but afraid of disrupting protocol. Catherine, heartbroken and torn between silence and salvation. Even a disgruntled aide, perhaps. Someone with access. Someone who had seen too much. The palace scrambled to respond, issuing a carefully worded statement. The late Queen's private writings were never intended as public record. They remained deeply personal reflections, not declarations. But it was too late. The public had decided otherwise, that one sentence had cracked the image of Charles's leadership, and no official memo could restore it. Behind the scenes, the royal family fractured even further. Trust eroded, tempers rose. The Diaries were no longer just a family secret. They were now the monarchy's greatest liability. As the royal facade crumbled, one person emerged with a voice not of power but of final truth. It was never meant to be public. But at a private memorial, William made a decision that would change royal history. Holding his grandmother's final entry in trembling hands, he spoke aloud, revealing a truth that left even his father in tears. The gathering was meant to be intimate, a private commemoration on what would have been Queen Elizabeth's birthday, held quietly away from the cameras and the press. Just family. No formal addresses, no speeches, only flowers, a few whispered prayers, and the weight of her absence. But when William rose from his seat, diary page folded in his palm, the room froze. No one expected him to speak, especially not with what he held. "Hi." S' voice was low, steady, and at first uncertain. Then came the silence, the breath before revelation. "These were her final words," he said, "and I believe they were meant for all of us." He unfolded the page, worn at the edges, the ink slightly faded, and then he read. The Queen had written not as a sovereign, but as a mother, a woman, and a witness to her own dynasty. She spoke of legacy not as something inherited, but as something shaped, protected, and chosen. She wrote of love for both her sons, each carrying parts of her, each tested in different ways, but she did not shy away from her truth. "Charles was forged by duty, and I do not doubt his strength," she had written. But William listens where others speak. He asks where others declare. He leads with silence before sound. That is the kind of king this age will need. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Anne lowered her head, tears slipping quietly down her cheek. Even Camilla sat still, hands clenched in her lap. And Charles, stoic, often unreadable, closed his eyes and lowered his gaze. No rebuttal, no defense, just a father, hearing his mother's unchangeable words. It wasn't an attack, it wasn't even a rejection, it was a truth spoken in love, and that made it all the more unbearable. William finished the entry, folded it once more and sat down. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. In that moment, he wasn't speaking as an heir or a prince or a future king. He was a grandson delivering the soul of a woman the world thought they knew but never truly did. For a brief moment there was unity. A fragile, aching peace hung over the room like fog. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them all. The diaries had changed everything. Not just because of what they revealed, but because of what they demanded. Reflection, reckoning, rebirth. The Queen's final words were not grand proclamations. They were quiet acknowledgements of pain, of strength, of chosen faith in the one person she believed could carry her voice forward without distortion. A man not shaped by power, but by conscience. And with that choice, she hadn't broken the monarchy, but forced it to look inward for the first time in generations. But even as the dust settled, the monarchy would never return to what it once was, because the Queen's final move had reshaped the very idea of inheritance. Monarchs rule by title, but legacies live through truth. In the end, Queen Elizabeth didn't just pass on a crown, she passed on her conscience. And in doing so, she forever changed the one man she trusted most, and the kingdom he was born to inherit. In the weeks that followed the memorial, the monarchy settled into a strange, uneasy quiet. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence that comes after a storm, when the debris is still being counted, and no one quite knows what to rebuild first. For William, the Queen's diaries had started as a private inheritance, but they had grown into something far greater. They had challenged the very structure of the institution he was being shaped to lead. And they had redefined his path, not by giving him answers, but by forcing him to ask the one question the monarchy had avoided for decades: what kind of leadership does the future deserve? Charles, wounded by exposure but worn down by years of restraint, began to shift, slowly, quietly. The rage that once boiled beneath his disappointment gave way to a somber kind of acceptance. Not approval, not peace, but recognition that some truths arrive whether invited or not. He resumed his royal duties with the same outward discipline, but behind the curtain, a new distance had grown between father and son. It was not hostile, it was not cruel, but it was real. A silence no crown could bridge. In public they stood side by side. In private they stood on separate foundations. Charles, The king by right, William, the heir by revelation. The public, however, had made their judgment. The leaked page, the speech, the emotion that rippled through the firm, all of it, painted William as something more than just a royal successor. He became the symbol of moral monarchy, a man who did not seize power but was entrusted with truth. A figurehead not just of tradition but of transformation. His popularity surged, not because of polished appearances or carefully curated images, but because he had stood still and allowed the Queen's voice to speak through him. And Anne, long viewed as the most hardened of the Queen's children, emerged from the shadows of duty into something far more revered. For years she had been cast as cold, stoic, unbending, but now the world saw what Elizabeth had seen all along: loyalty not to institution, but to integrity. She hadn't fought for power. She had protected something far rarer, a woman's final truth. And she had delivered it not with fanfare, but with fire. Eventually, the diaries were resealed, removed from circulation, archived in a vault even deeper than the one beneath Sandringham. But not all of them. One copy remained, unofficial, unindexed. Reportedly in William's possession, not for control, not for glory, but for guidance. Because in those pages, in that lifelong record of unspoken reflections, the Queen hadn't left instructions. She had left understanding. And sometimes, understanding is the only thing that see and shape a crown without shattering it. Her voice was never meant to echo from a throne. It was meant to echo from within the man she believed could change what the monarchy had become. And it has. The Queen is gone, but her final act was not ceremonial. It was personal, poetic, revolutionary. She passed the scepter with one hand, and with the other handed her soul. And so the crown remains, but its weight will never feel the same again, now that the voice behind it has finally been heard. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.